Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha.
Bring their voices, their knowledge.
We're going to display what we want to display.
Why? That narrative has been very beneficial.
Their ancestors who are being held by the Illinois State Museum system.
There's still hesitation.
A new law in Illinois means a significant change for how Native American burial remains are treated. St. Louis on the Air producer Danny Wicentowski has that story.
Since the earliest days of archaeology, the remains of more than 15,000 Native Americans have been excavated in Illinois. Dating back hundreds and even thousands of years, some remains became subjects of scientific study, while others were placed in museums. Often, they were displayed with the funerary objects that told the story of their lives and of their people. But for decades, Native American groups have struggled to convince state officials that these remains need to be returned and reburied. Those efforts did lead to action in the past. A federal law passed in 1989 ordered states to return remains to tribal groups, but it turned out that the law did very little of that. Earlier this year, an investigation by ProPublica found that the Illinois State Museum, which holds the remains of more than 7,000 Native Americans, had only returned the remains of 156 people. Now, a new law could change that, and to talk about these reforms, we welcome ProPublica reporter Logan Jaffe to the show. Logan, it's great to have you back.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Logan, we spoke to you on our show earlier this year about your investigations for ProPublica and your focus on Illinois. And so before we talk about the details of the new law, give us a reminder of the situation in Illinois up until now. How did the state view these burial remains, and how are they treated?
Sure. Illinois has a very long legacy of archaeology, even going back to the, late 1800s, 1920s, and even into the 1950s. So part of the reason why there was so much archaeology and why Illinois kind of became a nexus for early archaeology is because there are a lot of indigenous burial sites all throughout the state. There are more than 30 different tribal nations that have ancestral lands in the state of Illinois. In the 1830s, what became federally recognized tribes left in Illinois, they were all forcibly removed by these policies. And so in their absence, a lot of archaeology developed, and a lot of those archaeologists viewed their work here as sort of, nobody's going to push back against this.
Right. And as it turns out, and I think as you've pointed out, there were members of Native American tribal groups in Illinois and those who have been advocating for a change in this kind of law. But to your point, when these early archaeologists discovered them or uncovered them for themselves, rather, they put them in museums, but in a way that really troubled a lot of the Native groups. Tell us about that and how that status kind of led us to this point, to this new law.
Sure. One of them is Dixon Mounds Museum, and that is a branch of the Illinois State Museum. And what became Dixon Mounds Museum started with a guy named Don Dixon in the 1920s, and he owned some land that had massive burial mounds on them. So his family had known about these burial sites for at least a couple generations before he started digging in the 1920s. And he excavated, I think it was 234 human remains, but he left them in place in the ground and sort of dug around them. So he kind of excavated this burial mound, and then he opened that burial mound to the public and charged people admission to see the remains of what he believed and what he promoted to the public as a lost or gone race of people. And that was a very, widespread sentiment at that time. And, the state eventually purchased Don Dixon's exhibit and that eventually became what today is known as Dixon Mounds Museum. So that open burial exhibit closed in the early 1990s after a lot of pressure from tribal nations, and that was a very controversial closing at the time. There was a lot of pushback from the local community in west central Illinois there. And, people might not have heard of Dixon Mounds Museum, but if you're looking for a museum that you might be able to recognize, the Field Museum of Chicago, the roots of that museum go back to the World's Fair in the 1890s in Chicago. And the archaeologists at that time unearthed hundreds of, ancestral remains and funerary items from mounds in Ohio, shipped them back to, the city of Chicago by train, and displayed those at the World's Fair. And those collections became the founding collections of what today is the Field Museum.
Wow. So bring us up to this new law, the Human Remains Protection Act, which seems to really try to continue the work to undo that previous perspective of just using these remains and using these people's lives as exhibitions. What does the Human Remains Protection Act change about the way that Illinois museums have to treat these remains?
Sure. So it's a new law, but it's also kind of an amended law from a previous piece of legislation that was passed in 1989. So what that law, the earlier law, did is it criminalized looting and the desecration of burial sites for, any cultural groups in the state of Illinois. And that was passed 1 year before the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed in 1990, which, as we know, is a federal law. And that comes as a result of many decades of effort by indigenous people and tribal groups and different organizations really pushing for human rights and to get their ancestors treated as they deserve to be treated. So the state of Illinois passed this first law without mentioning in particular the needs of tribal nations. I think the law refers to these tribal nations as quote related groups. And what this new law does, the Human Remains Protection Act, it eliminates a lot of that potential gray area that the first law had. So it does a couple things. It establishes a way to actually fund repatriation, and it allows the state to create burial sites to actually allow tribal nations to rebury their ancestors in the way that they want to and in a way that they've been pushing for since even before the 1990s. So the state has known about the wishes of tribes to rebury their ancestors in the state for a long time.
Logan, the new law, the Human Remains Protection Act, it comes after decades of effort by these indigenous groups, by tribal nations. Have museums come around, in the intervening decades, or is there pushback and them saying, we're going to display what we want to display?
Yeah, it's an interesting time. So when the first, Human Skeletal Remains Protection Act, and that was the title of the 1989 law, there was the word skeletal in there, which the new law does not have that word anymore in the title. So the first law did not prohibit the display of Native American human remains. It, in a lot of ways, favored the scientific study and the archaeological benefit and scientific benefit. It kind of favored the pursuit of those over, repatriation and reburial to tribal nations. And what the new law does is it bans, obviously, like the display of human remains, which to your question, that fell out of practice around the time of NAGPRA's passage in the 1990s. But what did not change necessarily is the display of funerary items that Native American ancestors had purposely and intentionally buried with those individuals. So a lot of the times the practice was to separate those funerary items from the ancestral remains, and, those funerary items would be displayed. That is beginning to fall out of fashion, but it still happens fairly regularly.
Logan, this new law does a lot of more direct kind of direction toward the government and toward the museums. What specifically does the state and museums, now have to do?
Right. So NAGPRA passed in 1990. And since then, how that has played out in Illinois, it has been fairly slow. There have been more than 15,400 Native American remains excavated from Illinois. The vast majority of those are still held by Illinois museums, universities, and other institutions. And those institutions have only returned about 2% of that, of that number. So it's a very slow history of return. And what the Human Remains Protection Act that just passed does is it tries to eliminate some of the barriers that tribal nations have made known to state officials and also to federal officials for a long time now. So one of the biggest issues is funding. In Illinois, what's pretty interesting about the law is that it creates a repatriation and reburial fund that the state can appropriate money to do. And then money for that would also come from any fines, fees, fiscal punishments from people who end up breaking this law. So it creates a way to help start funding this. It's, really to be determined. It's hard to say how that will play out. And then the other thing it does is it allows the state to create different burial sites that just according to what and how tribal nations would like to rebury their ancestors.
Mm-hmm. And the location of these burials, this is a really big piece of it. And in your reporting, you kind of untangle some of the real challenges that this law is addressing. Part of it is where do these burials happen, who funds them, and you bring up an anecdote that had happened in 1999 when several tribal nations had tried to repatriate the remains of 34 of their ancestors held by the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. What happened there, and how does that illustrate maybe what this law is changing?
Yeah, so the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign held 34 ancestors that belonged to the Sac and Fox Nation, and there are 3 different tribes who are part of that nation, and they were excavated from a site along the Illinois River in the western part of the state that historically was a village that their ancestors made and lived in, and there was a burial site there that archaeologists excavated, I want to say, in the 1950s or 1960s. And when those ancestors were repatriated to those tribes, what they wanted to do is rebury those ancestors as close as possible to the site from where they were originally buried and where archaeologists excavated them from. And Jonathan Buffalo, a tribal historic preservation officer, told me that the state of Illinois at that time in 1999 wouldn't allow the tribe to rebury in that area. And so what the tribes decided to do is take their ancestors back to Iowa, and which is where at least the Sac and Fox tribe of the Mississippi in Iowa, where they're located, and bury them on their tribal lands. And what Jonathan Buffalo told me is that this really felt like a wave of the pain of what forced removal felt like, because it was, taking his ancestors without him really wanting to do this, take them west of the Mississippi River, which is the same, plan and mandate that the federal government had during the 1830s during forced removal. And it was the same, it felt the same to him. And that was a pretty deep cut.
We're talking about a new Illinois law which is empowering Native American tribes to repatriate the remains of their ancestors. And we're talking with Logan Jaffe, reporter with ProPublica, who's been covering this effort for several years. Logan, you've spoken to a number of tribal members, leaders of these tribal nations. What did they say about what it means to think about their ancestors who are being held by the Illinois State Museum system? What does this feel like to them, and what did they tell you about this law and what it means to them?
Yeah, I mean, so I want to say that this is a very sensitive topic, and there's a big concern about privacy and safety of choosing places for reburial, about how this happens. But from what I know, a lot of different tribes had direct input into the shaping of this law. So from what I know from reporting, I'm hearing optimism that, the state is at least trying to do the right thing, acknowledge its pretty, brutal and harmful history towards Indigenous people. The chairman of the Prairie Band's Potawatomi Nation said very publicly that, with the governor signing these bills into law, Illinois is proving that a government is capable of reflecting on its past. So, that's a direct quote from something that he said. So, you do hear optimism in some of this, but I'm also hearing a sense of, we'll see how this goes. There's still hesitation.
You brought up kind of some of the fundamental challenges of solving this issue. The forced removal of Native Americans is the reason why there are not federally recognized tribes in Illinois or in Missouri, for that matter. Many of them were, in the context of an ethnic cleansing, forcibly removed, taken from their lands. And that happened hundreds of years ago. And the negotiations, the land exchanges, those efforts have also happened over hundreds of years. How much of this is an attempt to solve something that is already deeply broken about the way that this country has treated its Native American tribes?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And from what I can tell from what officials with the Illinois State Museum have told me, from what folks with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, from what they've told me, it's, they see the passing of this law as just one piece of a larger vision that they have for the state of Illinois, which is to be in constant, conversation with tribal nations who are forcibly removed and bring their voices, their knowledge, and certainly rebury their ancestors in the state, but try to reverse, or at least begin to change, Illinois' history as a state of forced removal, and not necessarily shy away from that, from what has been described to me, but to start, infusing tribal knowledge back into everything from, official state processes to potentially rethinking the names of different historic sites throughout the state, of really thinking about whose stories have been erased and for what purpose, in Illinois' history. And so this could potentially, if you're looking at it very optimistically, be the beginning of kind of a re-infusion of tribal and Indigenous knowledge back into a state that has for so long been unwelcoming to tribal nations here.
Mhm. And Logan, I should mention, we've mentioned Dixon Mounds, we've mentioned the Fields Museum. Much closer to St. Louis are the Cahokia Mounds, these large structures made by a Native American civilization that predated the arrival of Europeans. It is an incredible place, and some of the mounds are filled with the remains of people, multiple burials. And when we talked to Lori Belknap, the superintendent of that state historic site earlier this year, her response, I think, evoked and reflected the complicated position that these museums are in. They are in support of any tribal decisions to have remains reburied at that site, but she also added that she's not going to presume that tribes may want to rebury there, but if they do, she will do everything to comply with that the Cahokia Mounds will work with those tribal groups. Now, that was a statement that was given to us before the passage of this law. Are there any specific avenues that a place like Cahokia Mounds is going to have to now follow with all of these remains, which predate many of any federally recognized tribe we have today? A situation like that, does this law make that any simpler, or is that a question that is still going to have to be answered down the line?
I think there are some things that it does make simple. One is what tribal nations have been saying for a long time, which is, listen to us, consult with us, be in constant communication with us about what our wishes for our ancestors are. And a lot of times, and this may be the case with Cahokia, there are many different tribes, working as a collective and saying, these are all of our ancestors and they don't belong to one specific tribe. Cahokia, it's a very important place to many different tribal nations. So, hearing that the comment from the superintendent of that park, saying that, we're going to do what tribes want to do. And we're not going to, the important thing is that people who are in charge of a place like Cahokia Mounds, like Dixon Mounds, like the Illinois State Museum, that they don't assume what tribal nations want. Because, she's right. Perhaps tribal nations don't want to rebury there. And it's frankly none of our business what they would like.
Logan, I should point out that on August 4th, Governor J.B. Pritzker signed this law, the Human Remains Protection Act. That was actually one of 3 laws that he signed related to Native American rights in Illinois. There was one that prohibits schools from banning students from wearing cultural regalia as graduation attire. That was actually related to an incident where a student was denied being part of their graduation because they wore Native regalia that was relevant to them. The second law is one that mandates instruction on Native American history in Illinois public schools. And at this press conference, Governor Pritzker, he said, here in Illinois, we believe in justice and we won't hide from the truth, and that it's up to us to right the wrongs of the past and to chart a new course. Now, I realize that that statement seems to really be relevant about not stopping students who are Native Americans from wearing parts of their culture, to learn about that culture in the school. But that point about truth, is there something that is important about the truth of the relationship between Illinois and Native Americans that is contained in this law? Does it get to that level?
Yeah. I think part of the truth here about how Illinois has told its history and who's been included in that or not is that, people who you have to listen to the sort of histories that have been erased and who has been doing the erasing. So if the state decides to, start addressing the history that it has told itself about being a state for a long time, then it has to also acknowledge, in addition to the genocide and brutality against Indigenous people, it has to also confront why that narrative has been very beneficial to the state perpetuating it. So, we might see that playing out. I know that the law of mandating that Native American Midwest history be taught in Illinois public schools very interestingly started because there are many Native American mascots used at high schools throughout the state. So if those schools are going to be teaching Native American Midwest history, they might also need to be confronting their own histories of why their school is either named what it is or why their mascot is, is a Native American vaguely referenced, caricature in some ways. So it can start very locally. And, what I'm hearing from that statement from Pritzker is also perhaps a nod to a larger retelling of how Illinois became Illinois.
Logan Jaffe is a reporter with ProPublica. Logan, thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you.
This episode was produced by Danny Wicentowski,
with audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.